traditional religions is probably a, a form of Christianity because I think it has the best historical evidence.
Alex O'Connor sat down with Rainn Wilson to discuss his obsession with the Bible, Christianity.
What is the best argument you've ever heard in your infinite number of debates, both online and in person, for the existence of God?
There are so many. I think there's even an argument for the existence of God that can be made just from the number of arguments for the existence of God. The fact that there's an argument from beauty, an argument from contingency, from ontology, from maths, from like any way you look, there's an argument for God. So you can always make an argument for God's existence from the sheer number of arguments for God's existence.
I haven't heard that before. That's great.
Depends what you mean. My favorite for a while has been the so-called ontological argument, where you sort of think God into existence. I think it's quite fun. You can just do it from an armchair. It doesn't require any observation. I mean, that's quite fun. I mean, it goes back to St. Anselm, who is praying. He's writing down this prayer. And he sort of challenges you in a way. He says, can you conceive of the greatest conceivable being?
I appreciate his honesty here. I think sometimes you hear people say things like, there isn't a good argument, or they're all bad. I was a bit surprised, personally, to hear him mention the argument from beauty. This isn't one that gets brought up very often. And I think it should, considering that he seems to embrace more of a relativism when it comes to his views. It just seems shocking. For each of these arguments, there are different versions. Some are stronger than others. Personally, I do think he kind of strawmanned what Anselm was saying here. God is, by definition, something than which nothing greater can be thought. In Anselm's proslogion, he starts off by saying, that than which nothing greater can be thought. And then he shifts to that which is greater than can be thought. This is a quote here from the proslogion. You are seeking God, and you have found that he is the highest of all things, than which nothing better can be thought, and that he is life itself, light, wisdom, goodness, eternal happiness, and happy eternity, and that he is everywhere and always.
What is it that obsesses you about the Bible and the Christian mythology?
This Jesus figure transformed the lives and societies of
Billions
who came after him, billions of people and hundreds, maybe thousands of societies. That's a mystery to explain. We don't know anything about his life between his birth and his baptism. Well, we know that Jesus existed. We know that Jesus was crucified. And we know that not long afterwards, lots of people started to believe that he'd risen from the dead. This is one of the most extraordinary events in human history. Society is disrupted. As a secular historian, how can you not be interested in that? I just find these conversations so interesting.
This is something that I really do appreciate about Alex. His willingness to investigate these claims and not just outright dismiss them. The fact that Jesus had this impact on society and the world really is fascinating. The fact that what he did has lasted for as long as it has, and that other major religions have to account for him, is just amazing. This is unprecedented. And I think this is what makes the Christian story resonate with so many people. Say what you want to say. Something happened over 2,000 years ago that drastically changed the course of human history. Before Jesus comes on the scene, the surrounding cultures and nations held to beliefs and views that were horrific. All of a sudden, Jesus shows up and this all starts to change. If you want to disagree with the claims of Christianity, you still have to account for this dramatic change. This has to be explained. What happened that led to this? The question is still there, and you have to provide an adequate answer. Now, as far as Jesus's life goes, this was the norm when writing about other figures around that time. Writing materials are very expensive, so people would focus on the most important aspects of a person's life, covering the highlights. I mean, we still do that now when you think about biographies and things like that. Just to be clear, I'm not saying that the gospel narratives are like modern day biographies. The gospel narratives are similar to ancient biographies. So I want to make sure I make that distinction. It is true that what we have in the gospel accounts doesn't cover Jesus' childhood, but some people will hear that and think, oh, we can't know anything about Jesus' life. That just isn't the case. The 4 gospel accounts give us a lot of detail about Jesus' earthly life, details that are best accounted for by recognizing that the people writing these things down were eyewitnesses. We know that Jesus existed, that he did certain things, and that he was crucified. Those 3 things alone dismiss quite a few false religions.
It's my favorite because it sounds a bit stupid.
Steven's not. You're not buying it. We can't.
He said, what about the greatest conceivable unicorn? This is the greatest objection to Anselm. People say, oh, well, you're just thinking God into existence, because what about the greatest conceivable unicorn? Like, okay, but what you've just done is limited your scope. Because I asked you to imagine the one on the mug.
Unicorn right here.
I was like, okay, imagine the greatest conceivable thing, right? And I'm like, that thing must exist in reality. Okay, well, the greatest conceivable unicorn has limited our scope, right? There could be a unicorn that you're imagining that's greater than another unicorn you're imagining, right? Okay, we can make that unicorn a better unicorn, like giving it a sharper horn and a more beautiful mane or whatever. But like, even if we imagine the greatest conceivable unicorn, we can make that unicorn a greater conceivable thing by giving it even more qualities. Well, let's make that unicorn all powerful,
telepathic, and
it doesn't make it a better unicorn, but it makes it a better thing.
Well, maybe I was too quick to give him his flowers. This objection isn't new, and this is something that one of Anselm's contemporaries also raised up when talking about this idea of the greatest conceivable island. I would strongly recommend checking out Gavin Orland's video on the ontological argument and a recent conversation with Joe Schmidt. I think Joe would agree with Alex on a few things, but it was a good back and forth between him and Gavin. I like Gavin's approach, and I have learned a lot from his content. It would be nice to see an interaction between Gavin and Alex. I think this kind of conversation will be very helpful, especially if, let's just say, they focus on the ontological argument. I think that would be very good.
It can be done. There are greater things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy,
Which would always consistently point me toward the divine. But what would it take for you to become a theist? Would it take increased understanding? Would it be an argument? Would it be some kind of scientific proof, on some kind of, molecular level, or some kind of string theory or unified theory or something like that, being proved that kind of has a light bulb go off for you? Or would it be some kind of lived experience, some kind of transcendent experience that you had with either psychedelics or falling in love or through tragedy or a vision? Or would it take some combination of all of those? Or could it ever possibly happen to you or someone like you?
I think it would be the second. I think it would be an experience for a few reasons. The first is that I think that the most plausible of traditional religions is probably a form of Christianity, because I think it has the best historical evidence, especially if you don't need to swallow the idea that Jesus is God. He's just like all this kind of stuff. I think that's kind of plausible. And within Christianity, it's quite clear that the way that people come to God is through experience.
Why Christianity over Islam?
I think it has better historical case for the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, both of which Islam denies.
So you would need a miracle like a resurrection to kind of prove to you the divine truth of Christianity?
No, I think that if the resurrection of Jesus happened as it was recorded, that would be a pretty good indication that there's something really special about this Jesus guy, and we should be taking what he says very seriously.
I think this is a really good question by Rainn. Sometimes we think that people just need to be convinced about something intellectually, when I would say a lot of times what is presented as an intellectual objection or doubt, when you press a little deeper, it turns out to be more of an emotional objection. Not saying that this is always the case, but I do think this happens more often than not. Alex's response is somewhat shocking, but when you consider some of his most recent conversations, this does make sense. It seems that one of his biggest objections is the problem of evil, with good reason, particularly what he would call needless animal suffering. The explanations that have been put forward in these conversations have been more on the intellectual side, and while I think they do resonate, they don't always suffice. So this is from Lisa Fields. She recently had a conversation on Hardly Initiated, and she talks about philosophical or emotional responses. Here's what she says. Sometimes I think we have to be honest as people who are skeptics that we're not really looking for philosophical answers. We're looking for emotionally satisfying answers. And if emotionally satisfying answers is the goal line, then it's going to be challenging because emotionally satisfying answers aren't always what is liberative. Alex is going to get himself into some trouble saying these types of things about Christianity. Doesn't he know that there is no evidence for Christianity? This is all made up stuff. This is one of the things I appreciate about Alex, his willingness to admit this, even if he doesn't agree with the position wholesale. And then he makes this other comment. Alex, there is no Christianity if Jesus isn't God. That's kind of the whole premise. It's literally named after the guy who rose from the dead. A Christianity that doesn't recognize Jesus as God is not Christianity. That's a heresy. Maybe he's after something along the lines of LDS or Jehovah's Witnesses. He does seem to have a fascination with Joseph Smith and Mormonism. I wonder if Alex is aware of some more well known Christians who have come to faith through examining the evidence. People like Lee Strobel, J. Warner Wallace, and others. I mean, I'm sure that experience played a role in their conversion to Christianity, but I don't think that was the deciding factor. The comment about the crucifixion in Islam, I think this is one of the many reasons to reject Islam. It contradicts historical evidence, right? It opposes what happened in history. Now, his comment about the resurrection, right? If it really happened, then we should listen to what he says. I think this really hits. And this is something that Paul says in Corinthians. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain. We are even found to be misrepresenting God because we testified about God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if it is true that the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins. The resurrection is the hinge point for Christianity, right? If the resurrection didn't happen, then we should be pitied most of all. Our faith is in vain and it is futile. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for tuning in. I'll catch you next time.